Kia ora, and welcome to another video celebrating World Breastfeeding Week 2020. This is intended as a platform to share diverse experiences and information, and we hope that you find this series supportive and informative. It is important to note that these are personal stories and opinions and do not necessarily reflect the views of Women's Health Action or our funders. Please seek advice from your health professional before making any important decisions about infant or young child feeding.
Kia ora koutou, ko Miriam toku ingoa. Hi everyone, I hope you're well. My name is Miriam. I'm a breastfeeding mother and a trained breastfeeding peer support counsellor in Waitaha, Aotearoa, Canterbury, New Zealand. I've been asked to make a video about my breastfeeding journey for World Breastfeeding Week 2020. Thank you for clicking on the video and supporting breastfeeding. I hope that my experience is interesting or helpful to someone out there. I'll be sharing some of my thoughts about the things that I've found helpful, the challenges I've had, support I've received, and some of the highlights of breastfeeding for me and my daughter. I've provided some timestamps for the key parts of my video, so if you want to skip forward or back to any of those parts, check the details in the description below. So one of my most vivid memories as a child of seeing another baby being breastfed was when I first met my sister after she was born. So I was 4 years old, and I remember the first time I saw her, she was actually breastfeeding at the time, and I just thought she looked so cute. And you know, it just felt really calm. I feel like I could sense the power of breastfeeding. I'm really glad that I have that memory, especially you know, throughout my breastfeeding journey. The more that I think back to it, the more meaningful it's become. My other memories of breastfeeding sort of through my life, I feel like often the mother and baby sort of went off into another room or space to sort of breastfeed in private, you know, which is fine and understandable, but I think it sort of meant that breastfeeding wasn't that visible to me throughout my life. And looking back on that now, I sort of wish that I had more exposure to breastfeeding, and you know, maybe being able to learn some practical things from breastfeeding mothers that would have helped me in my journey. So I'm currently breastfeeding. I have a 2-year-old daughter who I have breastfed since she was born. She's just over 2 now. I don't like to say we're still breastfeeding. That's a phrase I don't really like. I think it implies that you know, maybe we shouldn't be breastfeeding still, and you know, that couldn't be further from how either of us feel right now. We don't have any plans for stopping anytime soon. Breastfeeding is something that we've both really enjoyed and have gotten so many benefits from. We have had our challenges along the way, but you know, overall it's been a really positive experience, and you know, we've received a lot of support. So obviously pregnancy, labor and birth are among many of the things that can impact breastfeeding. So I'll briefly mention a few parts of my experience of these events. I had a pretty normal pregnancy. I did have a lot of stress and chaos going on in my life, but my pregnancy itself was straightforward and healthy. I also had a very positive birth experience, which I credit largely towards hypnobirthing, in particular removing fear around birth, positive affirmations, breathing and relaxation techniques were super helpful to me. So I had a natural vaginal delivery without any interventions or any medications, you know, no pain relief drugs or anything like that. Immediately after my daughter was born, she was placed onto my chest, skin to skin, and latched on straight away. And yeah, it was wonderful. So I had done quite a lot of research into breastfeeding, you know, to prepare. Even before I was pregnant, but while I was pregnant especially, my midwife had suggested or had recommended that I do a breastfeeding course that was available. I think it was at the hospital, the one she was recommending, but you know, there are a few around. And I remember wanting to do it and sort of intending to, but never quite getting around to it. I sort of felt like I'd done enough homework, and you know, I was still working at the time, and it sort of felt a bit hard to fit in. Looking back now, it's something that I probably should have done and would have benefited from. But anyway, I didn't do it at the time. So in the early days, I did find breastfeeding really difficult. Latching was a huge challenge for me. Um, it was super painful. I think her latch was really shallow, and I found it particularly hard to breastfeed to latch on my right breast compared to my left. But I did struggle with both sides. My daughter was born in a hospital, and we were there for a couple of days, and I had a lot of help from the midwives and nurses there. I felt like I was pressing the button at every single feed for someone to come in and help get her latched on. Yeah, it was really hard, but everyone was really helpful. Although, I mean, that's what I thought at the time, and I guess they were, their intentions were, but I think there were a few bad habits or poor technique that they'd kind of taught me, which made latching actually quite a lot worse. So I sort of wish that I was more aware of it at the time. But I just trusted them. I thought, they do this every day. They're professionals. They've had their training. They know what they're doing. They're helping me. I was doing better with their help than I was without. But yeah, some of the things that they were doing that I think contributed to a poor latch was actually holding the back of my daughter's head to push her onto my breast to latch on, and then kind of holding her head there during the feed. But I know now that that's not a good thing to do, and that you don't want to be pushing their head, and you want to support them at their back and pull them in close, to your body from their back. That was something that I did a lot at the beginning that took me quite some weeks to correct. While I was still in hospital, I was visited by a lactation consultant. I think it was on the day that I left the hospital, but before I left, she came and saw me. And my daughter was actually asleep at the time that she popped in, so she didn't actually get to observe us breastfeeding, but we were able to have a conversation, and I did talk about the latching issues that I was experiencing and the pain. And she gave me some really good advice that unfortunately I did not follow. And I remember at the time thinking, wow, this is I'm never going to forget this, but regretfully, I didn't apply what she'd said, which was to never settle for a bad latch. And I constantly settled for a bad latch all the time. I don't really know why, but I did. As I mentioned before, I did have a lot going on in my personal life, and I tired after giving birth, all that kind of stuff. I was just happy that my daughter was here. I knew that breastfeeding wasn't supposed to be painful. I'd read all the books and everything on the internet and watched all the videos, talked to my midwife, all that kind of stuff. And it's like I knew all of this information, but I wasn't necessarily acting on it, which is a huge shame. Don't do what I did. Don't settle for a bad latch. If you are having any difficulty with breastfeeding or are experiencing any pain, seek help straight away. Don't wait. It's not going to get better on its own. Just get help. Just speak up and get help. So I was still having latching issues after I left the hospital, and I moved cities as well. So I changed midwives during that first 6 weeks of my daughter's life. And similarly to the lactation consultant who didn't observe me breastfeeding, my new midwife, I can't remember if she ever actually saw me breastfeeding or not. She might have, but if I was feeding in front of somebody, I would tend to choose my left breast because it was a lot less stressful for me and a lot less painful. And so I think I probably did that a lot if my midwife was there, and which I shouldn't have done that. I don't know why we try to pretend that everything's okay when it's not, but that's what I did. And so I don't think my midwife really understood the extent of the difficulties and pain that I was experiencing. Also, another thing as well was my daughter was absolutely thriving, which was great. She was packing on the pounds, growing like a champ. I think there was a couple of weeks in those first few weeks where she was putting on like 500 grams a week, and she was actually born, I should have said she was actually born quite small. She was really healthy, but on the small side, under the 10th percentile. But within a few short weeks, she shot right up to 99th percentile. And so, on paper, it was like, wow, she's growing so well. You're obviously doing the right thing. Keep doing what you're doing. But actually, I was often crying when I was breastfeeding, and I was really struggling. But that wasn't something that was visible on paper, and I'm human, I guess, and I tended to downplay, the struggles that I was going through, which I regret now. And I'd really encourage people not to do that. There's no shame or I don't know. There's nothing negative to come out of speaking up about the challenges you're going through and trying to get help for them. So I basically went on like this for a few weeks, and it kind of all came to a kind of all escalated to this one night in particular where I was curled up on the floor in a ball, crying and completely dreading and panicking about my next feed because I was experiencing so much pain. And it was horrible. It was really horrible. I talked to a family member and we decided that I definitely needed to get some help, and that the next morning we would go to a breastfeeding peer support group. So that's what we did the next morning. I didn't really know what to expect. It wasn't really something that I had really heard about before. Yeah, I sort of felt anxious that I would be critiqued about my poor latching, my poor breastfeeding technique, and kind of told off. But my actual experience couldn't have been further from my fears and worries. The breastfeeding peer support counselors that I met were all amazing. There was a lactation consultant there that day running a drop-in clinic as well. So I got some support from her as well as the peer counselors. Straight away, they were able to make me feel comfortable and reassure me that they were going to be able to help. And they were able to help. They helped me with my latching technique straight away, and gave me some tips, which I won't go into now. It's all the general stuff that information that's already out there. And so after that, it was really about just practicing what I'd learned, and kind of having that discipline to not settle for a poor latch, and just to feel I deserved to enjoy breastfeeding, and it didn't have to be the horrible kind of experience that it sort of had been up until that point. So one of the ironic things about finally getting help, which was when my daughter was 8 weeks old, that was when I went to the breastfeeding peer support group. She was 8 weeks old. So one of the ironic things was that shortly after, I think within a few days actually of going, I actually had a red lump appear on my right breast. And as I said before, I'd done a lot of research and felt pretty knowledgeable about, things to look out for with breastfeeding, mastitis, etc. And so I was like, okay, I know what to do. Making sure that I was feeding frequently from that breast and massaging it, applying a warm compress, having a warm shower, all those kind of things. And so yeah, it was just a small little red lump, and I didn't have any other symptoms, like I didn't feel sick or have a fever and that kind of thing. And I remember, the lump was still there, and I was kind of doing things, and it didn't seem to be getting any better. And over time, it was kind of slowly growing and starting to feel a bit painful. And I remember thinking, maybe stupidly, but I remember thinking, well, I don't have a fever. I haven't had a fever. It's not mastitis. It must just be a blocked duct. I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing, and hopefully it'll go away. I didn't learn from my previous mistake of just hoping problems would go away, because they don't. But I I basically just let it go on for a bit too long. I had this lump for, it was probably about 3 or 4 weeks before I decided to get some help. Again, I hadn't had a fever or anything like that, which I told my doctor, and the lump had grown quite a lot bigger. It was like maybe about this big. Um, and the doctor examined me, asked me all the questions, and kind of thought like, okay, I'll just keep doing what you're doing, and I'll prescribe you some antibiotics. And if you, and it's up to you whether you'd like to take them or not. You can choose to wait a few more days, and if it doesn't get better, then take the antibiotics. Um, so um, so that's what I did. I went home. I kind of had a bit more discipline about the feeding and massaging and all that stuff, but um, it didn't help. Surprise, surprise. I think it was a little bit late at this point, so I decided to start taking the antibiotics. And I think it was 1 or 2 days after seeing the doctor, and then another day or two after that, the lump just seemed to be getting worse and a lot more painful. So I went back to my doctor. So this was 4 days after initially seeing her. I went back and just kind of explained, that the lump had even grown quite visibly. It was very red and swollen, and very painful. My doctor didn't. I mean, at the time she seemed really helpful and concerned, but she didn't seem very worried. She didn't think that it was anything too serious going on, which instinctively I didn't quite agree with, but I didn't really say anything. I just kind of took her word, and she basically recommended to just continue taking the antibiotics, which I did, and that because it was a Friday, and if I had any issues over the weekend, to pop into after hours clinic. And so that's what I found myself doing the very next day, and things had gotten a lot more painful and swollen. I saw a doctor straight away. He was like, "Oh, you're going to need an operation." And part of me was worried, but I was also kind of relieved that, I did kind of feel like, okay, it's going to get sorted out now. He rang the hospital straight away and said, that I had a breast abscess, and that he needed to book me in for surgery. So they scheduled an appointment for the very next morning, and he told me to turn up at the hospital. I think it was at 9 a.m. the next day, and so and he said to just in the meantime I could take like some over-the-counter pain relief if I needed to. And so I went home that night, and it was a really horrible night. I didn't get any sleep. He'd also told me that I had to stop eating and drinking because the surgery that I was going to require was going to be under general anesthetic. And so, yeah, it's pretty hard not to eat or drink when you're breastfeeding, but I knew it wasn't going to be for too long of time. So, I followed his instructions. But yeah, in the early hours of the morning, the pain had just gotten so bad. I was in tears, and I ended up getting driven to the emergency room at about 5 in the morning, and so they admitted me a little bit earlier, and gave me some pain relief and things like that. And then I was kind of just waiting for my surgery. And naturally, being in hospital waiting for surgery, there were a lot of other surgeries, urgent surgeries that came up that were prioritized above mine, which is completely understandable. But it was hard having to wait and not being able to eat or drink. I eventually had my surgery, I think it was a day or two later, and the surgery went really well. They ended up having to remove the abscess. Oh, actually, before I even had my surgery, the abscess, this is kind of gross, actually ended up rupturing, so it actually burst while I was waiting and kind of getting delayed. And so I burst outside externally, and it was pretty gross. It was all infected, and there was pus and all kinds of yucky stuff. Anyway, they had to remove the abscess, and actually my breast tissue had started to rot, so they had to actually remove a bit of my breast as well. And so I ended up with like a hole in my breast that was about 4 centimeters deep, I think. There's a name for this type of wound, but in terms of the healing process, because I had an infection, they had to allow the wound to heal from the inside out, because if it sort of closed over, there was a risk of the infection still being there. So they had to pack the wound so that it would heal from the inside out. It was a very challenging time in the hospital. Obviously I was still breastfeeding my daughter, so I had family staying with me to be able to keep my daughter there with me. I was very unwell, and I had been given medications, and I hadn't reacted to some of them very well. So I was feeling very nauseous. I couldn't really do much. All I wanted to do was sleep. So I had family look after my daughter and just bring her to me for each feed and then kind of take her away again. But they stayed by my side at the hospital, which was amazing, and I'm really grateful for their support. After my surgery, I was seen by a hospital lactation consultant to help ensure that basically that this problem didn't happen again with my right breast. So I was totally fine on my left breast at this point, but we were all worried about my right breast getting engorged, and basically having the same problem occur from her not feeding effectively on it. It's not completely clear what the exact cause of the lump was. We wanted to avoid it happening again. So I had a lot of stress because that breast was really painful and the wound was quite close to my nipple. So it was I just didn't want to feed on that side, to be honest. So the lactation consultant was really helpful in trying to help find different positions that would be more comfortable. But we couldn't really find any. I sort of ended up just crying, and so we tried a breast pump to keep the breast drained. But again, because the wound was so close to my nipple, the breast pump ended up actually covering the wound. And so, like, when we were trying to extract milk, there was also milk and other stuff coming out of the wound. It was pretty gross. So the lactation consultant was really helpful and kind of creative, and we tried cutting the pump and kind of creating like a unique pump for my breast. But it was really hard, and so we actually talked about the option of stopping breastfeeding on that side. By this point, it had already been like 2 or 3 days that I hadn't really breastfed on it anyway. So in terms of like the engorgement and all of that kind of stuff, the risks around that, had kind of peaked already. So it was sort of like quite safe by this point to be able to just go, okay, maybe I can just continue breastfeeding only on my left breast, let my right breast heal, and then maybe later I can look at relactating that breast and breastfeeding on it again. Because of the wound, when I got home from the hospital, I actually had to have a nurse come and visit me every day to clean it and repack it, and that was excruciating. I mentioned earlier that I had a natural birth, with no pain relief or anything like that, and I had a really positive experience. It was intense, but I mean, I wouldn't even call it painful, but having this wound cleaned and repacked was awful. And I didn't like the idea of taking pain relief for it. I was given some that were prescribed to me and sort of safe for breastfeeding, but I did notice that they did make my daughter quite drowsy. Obviously, with it passing through in my breast milk, and I wasn't comfortable with that. So it was very painful having the nurses come, and they were all lovely, but they had to come for, I think it was like 7 or 8 weeks until the wound finally healed. In the meantime, a few days after I left the hospital, I actually ended up having an allergic reaction to the antibiotics that I was on, and I had a full body rash that lasted for many days, and it was horrible. It was so itchy, like a literally head to toe rash. I ended up back at the 24-hour clinic because, yeah, it was a weekend, I think, when the rash appeared. And anyway, there wasn't really much that they could do. Just had to kind of wait for it to all clear out of my system. And so they kind of gave me some creams and stuff to sort of help relieve it. But to be honest, it didn't really do that much. And it was a very difficult time, continuing to breastfeed my daughter. She was still very young. I was tired. She was still waking up at night to breastfeed. And so I'm really grateful that I had family support to help me during the day and cook me food and all that kind of thing. Part of the process after I'd left the hospital was, as an outpatient, I had to go back to the hospital, I think 2 weeks after my surgery, to kind of check on how things were going. And that experience was actually quite scary for me because 2 weeks after the surgery, my wound hadn't really healed that much at all. The doctor that saw me basically said that I might have to stop breastfeeding because I was still producing milk on the right breast, and there was a lot of, every time I breastfed on my left side, my right breast would leak out of my nipple and out of the wound, and it was keeping the wound very wet, which they said was meant that it was harder for the wound to heal because it needed to be dry. They actually told me that if the wound didn't heal in the next couple of weeks, that I would have to stop breastfeeding. And I was really shocked to hear this. It kind of didn't really make sense to me, to be honest. As soon as I left that appointment, I burst into tears, and I was crying to a family member, about what had happened, what they'd said to me. And coincidentally, that day was the breastfeeding peer support group that I had attended previously. So we drove straight there, and I saw the lactation consultant that had previously helped me, and I just broke down and told her what was going on, and she was like, hold on a minute, like, can you explain it again? Like, it's okay, calm down, what's happening? And so I told her what they'd said, and she kind of thought, didn't really make sense, what they were saying, because in terms of stopping breastfeeding, that whole process can take a long time for your breast to stop producing milk, and it sort of didn't really make sense, in terms of the amount of time that it would take to stop breastfeeding anyway. Surely the wound would be able to heal or at least improve during that time. So she basically calmed me down and was like, look, it's okay, you're still breastfeeding on your left. It should heal, like, especially with the properties, like antibacterial properties of breast milk. Obviously do your best to keep the breast dry, the wound dry, but it shouldn't stop it from healing. And so she offered to actually write a letter to the doctor that I'd seen with her professional advice as a lactation consultant about my situation. And what was really wonderful as well was that she actually offered to come with me to my next appointment to help advocate for me. And that was something that was really meaningful to me at the time. And I remember thinking, wow, like, I didn't even know that, that was a thing. It hadn't occurred to me to bring another professional as an advocate for me. I always thought of bringing a family or friend, but that was really cool that she offered it. And that kind of gave me more confidence to advocate for myself, and I ended up not needing her to come with me. But yeah, a couple of weeks later when I went back, the wound had actually improved so much that they were able to discharge me, and said that, hey, you've actually proved us wrong. We were wrong about thinking that it wouldn't heal, yeah, I still needed to have the nurses come and clean the wound and repack it for a few more weeks after that, but they were happy that I could be discharged. So that was amazing. It was really scary being told, that I might have to stop breastfeeding, and I'm so grateful for the support that I had from the lactation consultant. Just going through that process was really awful and helped to give me a lot of empathy for mothers that haven't been able to breastfeed. Yeah, so from this point, my wound healed, and breastfeeding on my left side had gone really well. and my rash had gone and all that stuff. And this is where I really, really started to enjoy breastfeeding. Because it wasn't like difficult anymore, and my daughter was a bit bigger. We had the latching sorted. So I just wanted to mention a few things that were that have been helpful to us. So one of the things I learned through my breastfeeding journey was a lot about my posture and like where I hold tension. And I found that in the early days, especially because I was experiencing so much pain, that I was often breastfeeding, like hunched like this and very tense. And even now, I mean, I do tend to still slouch quite a lot, which I'm trying to work on. But just being really aware of your body, where you're holding tension, and trying to be comfortable, making sure you're comfortable before you breastfeed and while you breastfeed. And if you're not comfortable, to just adjust your position. Also, something that I learned to do, which I'd struggled with earlier on, I had tried it, but I wasn't really sort of able to do until she was about 3 or 4 months old, maybe, which was breastfeeding while lying down on my side. And that once I sort of got that down, it was amazing. It was a bit of a game changer. I was able to relax a lot more and just be more comfortable while I was feeding. Also, something that we had done since she was born was co-sleeping and bed sharing. So we've slept in the same bed together, and we still sleep in the same bed together now. And that's something that's been really wonderful. It's made breastfeeding through the night very easy for us. I feel like it's helped me to get a lot more rest. And also just help with that closeness and that bond with my daughter. Obviously, it's something that you have to do safely. Another thing that's been really valuable for me in parenting in general, but also specifically with breastfeeding, has been babywearing. And breastfeeding whilst carrying my daughter in a baby carrier. So in the first few months, we used a stretchy style wrap. Those are quite common for newborns and young babies. And then we've tended to prefer sort of structured carriers with buckles, which is a little bit older. Something that's been really great is having access to baby wearing groups and trained baby wearing consultants who can help you to find the right type of carrier for you, help you learn how to use it and wear it comfortably and safely. And they have lots of carriers that you can try on or borrow. And that's something that we've taken advantage of, and it's been amazing. Baby wearing is something that I recommend in general to parents. And if you haven't tried breastfeeding whilst carrying your baby in a baby carrier, you should definitely give it a go. Initially, I just kind of had in my mind that it was going to be something that was going to be really difficult to figure out how to do, and that it might be uncomfortable. But once I actually tried it, it was super easy, and it was really life-changing in terms of being able to move around the house or be out and about whilst breastfeeding. With breastfeeding whilst using a baby carrier, it allows you to be quite discreet if that's something that you are concerned about, because often the carrier kind of blocks people's view, of your breast and things like that. And it's really easy to use clothing or a jacket or something like that to just provide a bit of privacy for your baby. And most of the time when I've breastfed whilst my daughter has been in a carrier, people haven't even noticed. And it's just, it's really wonderful, and it's just super helpful and practical, particularly while traveling with my daughter, which is what I was going to talk about next. Right before COVID-19, we were actually able to get in a few months of traveling in Asia. So we traveled to about 5 different countries, mostly to visit family so that they could meet my daughter for the first time. And it was really wonderful to be able to connect with them and talk about breastfeeding and their experiences if they'd breastfed or not, and just kind of get a bit more of a different perspective on breastfeeding, outside of what we know in New Zealand and what's common here. We went to Japan and stayed with a Japanese host family who had 2 young children, and the youngest was 3 years old and was breastfeeding. It was really wonderful to be able to connect with her and her mother kind of talk about culture around breastfeeding. Being able to breastfeed whilst carrying my daughter was super helpful, during the day while we were exploring and wandering around everywhere on foot. I have to say that overall, since I've begun breastfeeding, I haven't really had any negative experiences in terms of like social situations where, people have made me feel uncomfortable or made comments or that kind of thing. Everyone's been really supportive in terms of family and friends, strangers. I've had a bus driver, when I got on the bus, say to me, if anyone tries to give you any trouble for breastfeeding, let me know and I'll sort them out. I'll kick them off the bus, and yeah, that was really cool. I've also had the beautiful opportunity to breastfeed someone else's child, which is my nephew, who is a few months younger than my daughter, and something that my sister and I had talked about previously was, whether we would ever breastfeed, each other's children in the future, and she was the sister that I mentioned earlier that I, of my first memory of seeing a baby being breastfed, was her, and so when our children were born, it was something that we talked about being open about. If there was an appropriate opportunity, welcoming the other person to breastfeed our child if we were in a situation where it made sense. And that opportunity occurred several times for me when my nephew was in his first few months, and it was really awesome to be able to breastfeed him. It was really, really cool to be able to experience breastfeeding another child than my own, and I really felt like it helped develop my bond with him. And just from the practical side of it being useful to help calm and feed him in a few situations. My sister's also been able to breastfeed my daughter a few times as well, which has just been really nice. It feels quite full circle, with that memory that I mentioned before. I think a lot of people, might find it weird to breastfeed someone else's child, but to me, it just feels like a normal thing. That you would do as a human being, I think it's really cool for women to be able to share that role of breastfeeding, and it would be wonderful if it was done more. I think in the past it was something that was probably quite normal, and in some cultures today as well. But I guess modern Western society, it's not really something that we see. I'd really encourage you to have that discussion, and where appropriate and where respectful of everyone involved, it can be really special. Something that was a little bit unexpected for me in my breastfeeding journey was how my breastfeeding journey would actually impact my journey as a vegan. I've been vegan now for 4 or 5 years. It's really been amazing how much breastfeeding has strengthened my choices, my life choices. It's quite a big topic, and I'll save it for another video perhaps. Something that I decided to do last year when my daughter was just over a year old was to participate in some breastfeeding peer support counsellor training. So there's a few programs here in Canterbury available to train mothers who have breastfed to be able to help support other mothers, and it was something that I was really interested in doing because I had received so much support from these services in my breastfeeding that I wanted to be able to give back and help some other mothers. I did a training program for 8 weeks, and I learned a lot. And I almost think that every breastfeeding mother, whether or not they want to be a peer support counsellor, should go through this training. Since completing the training, I've been able to support quite a few mums with their breastfeeding goals, and that's been really, really wonderful. I do hope to continue breastfeeding my daughter for as long as we both want to. Right now I don't have any plans to wean her at a certain age, but just to allow her to wean herself when she's ready, gently and gradually in her own time. She'll probably be ready before I am, and I hope to continue supporting other mothers with breastfeeding as well. Making this video has been a great reflection process for me. I've been really worried that after I finish making this video, I'm going to think of all the important things that I forgot to say, but I've just had to go for it and just do things, not to overthink them. I hope that this video has been valuable to you. And I hear my daughter calling for me now. She probably wants to breastfeed. But yeah, thank you so much for watching this video and for supporting breastfeeding. Take care. Bye.